The reason Titanic is interesting is that although it's a relatively small disaster in terms of its death toll, it is extraordinarily impactful culturally. Similarly, the Space Shuttle Challenger is one of these disasters that, I mean, it didn't kill many people, 7 people, the crew, but every American beyond a certain age remembers that event. And I'll tell you one more thing, and then I'm going to shut up, and we'll have a conversation about that disaster, because it's really important. When the space shuttle blew up, spectacularly, just seconds after its launch, the first response of the Washington press corps, of the media, was to try to blame the president. And the story was that the space shuttle launch had been rushed at the orders of Ronald Reagan because he wanted to mention it in his State of the Union address. Now, this was fake news. There had never been any intention to mention it in that speech. So what really happened? I will tell you this. The physicist Richard Feynman discovered that the NASA engineers knew that there was a 1 in 100, 1% chance that the space shuttle would blow up. They knew that. They knew why too. They knew that the O-rings that kept the fuel from leaking from the launch tanks contracted in cold weather, so that if it was a cold day, the probability was probably even worse than 1 in 100. But in the NASA bureaucracy, there was a little man named Mr. Kingsbury. Mr. Kingsbury. And Mr. Kingsbury changed 1 in 100 to 1 in 100,000, which is different. And as I read Feynman's account, I thought, you know, there are a lot of Mr. Kingsburys in the history of disaster. And just as there's this strong temptation in 1986 to blame Reagan if you possibly could, last year there was an even more powerful temptation in the United States to blame it all on Trump. It was so satisfying. It solved the problem of why the United States was doing so badly. It was Trump. Jim Fallows wrote a whole essay for The Atlantic saying pilot error was all his fault. Now, I am not saying that Trump made no mistakes. He made so many that you lost count. What I try to show in the book is that those mistakes cannot explain the very high levels of mortality in the United States last year. And if you tell yourself as an American, it was all Trump's fault and we got rid of him, therefore the problem is solved, you haven't understood the nature of disaster. Because the nature of disaster is that the point of failure is sometimes quite far down the chain of command. It is Mr. Kingsbury. The things that killed people last year in large numbers were failure to provide adequate tests early on, absence of any system of contact tracing, failure to protect the elderly in elderly care homes, and then a failure to quarantine potentially infected people. None of those things had anything to do with Donald Trump, nor in Britain were they the fault of Boris Johnson. These were failures of the public health system. CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, utterly failed to provide enough tests. And it would have failed in pretty much the same way if Joe Biden had been president a year earlier. Tolstoy says in War and Peace, the greatest of all novels, that the illusion of the time, of the period around 1812, was to think that it was Napoleon and Napoleon alone that made it all happen. This fallacy that we think the leaders are all important is still very much alive in the Western media and indeed non-Western media today. And Doom says, let's not exonerate bad leaders. But let's recognize that often in a disaster, the point of failure is further down the chain of command. And this is important because the next disaster could very well play out in the same way. Who was Mr. Kingsbury last year? It was a man named Robert Cadleck. Have you heard of Robert Cadleck? Robert Cadleck was the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness at the Department of Health and Human Services. It was his job. And he was therefore the man who oversaw the 36-page Pandemic Preparedness Plan that came out in 2018. But not long after it was published, Robert Cadleck gave a lecture, a talk, at the University of Texas. And a friend of mine, Philip Zellicoe, found this talk, and he sent it to me. There's a video. And in the talk, the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness says, if we don't have a real insurance plan against a pandemic, we're going to be SOL if there is one. Now, I didn't know what SOL meant, because it's an American military acronym, and it's short for shit out of luck. We're going to be whistling in the wind a bit, said Cadleck. This was just after they'd published the Pandemic Preparedness Plan. So doom is about that kind of thing. It asks the question, why, given that we know so much more scientifically than any previous generation, that we can sequence the genetic structure of a virus in a matter of hours and devise highly efficacious vaccines even in days. And yet, somehow, with all our knowledge, we still cannot bring this disease under control. And the answer cannot simply be that some governments are led by incompetent populists. That is not a sufficient explanation. Somewhere in the Pentagon, there is a 36-page cyber attack preparedness plan. And my guess is that it will be about as good as the pandemic preparedness plan when the cyber attack happens. The final insight of the book is that it is better to be generally paranoid, to be open to a whole range of possible disasters, than to be meticulously prepared for the wrong disaster. You do not get the disaster that you want. You get the disaster that history, the great ironical God, gives you. So I think one of the reasons that we did badly last year was Mr. Kingsbury and Mr. Cadleck and all the other people whose job it was who did it badly. But there's another reason, and that is, more than in any recent pandemic, more than in 1957, crazy ideas proliferated from the outset about the virus, about treatments, about vaccines. The internet has created, as I argued in my last book, The Square and the Tower, which I think was Plätze und Türme, the internet has created a vast machine for reviving magical thinking. And the revival of magical thinking, the belief that the vaccine will inject a microchip into your bloodstream, which half of the people who refuse to be vaccinated believe in the United States. Magical thinking is back. And magical thinking is in some ways more contagious than COVID. And you're asking yourself, is there a vaccine? Is there a vaccine for magical thinking? And the answer is that there is. And it's available here. Thank you very much indeed.